and thank you for exploring Lakehead International's videos. My name is Jordan, and I am the International New and Social Media Officer. I'm also the host of the Lakehead International Live series, a fun and informative way for you to connect with current international students, professors, and ask questions about admissions and everything Lakehead. You are about to watch a recording from one of our previous live sessions. If any questions arise throughout the video, please do not hesitate to comment below. If you would like to check out some of our upcoming live sessions, please head over to our website at lakeheadu.ca/international-live. Let's begin. Hello folks, and good morning. Welcome to another Lakehead International Live. Today we're doing our final international lecture showcase, Illusions and the Science of Psychology. We're joined by our special guest, Dr. Michael Moland, who I'll introduce in just a moment, but we are also joined by my coworker, Hector, who's going to be answering questions behind the scenes throughout today's session. So if you do have any questions, whether it's related to Lakehead University or for our special guest lecturer, I encourage you to keep those all within the Q&A. With that being said, I want to thank you again for joining us, whether it's your morning, your afternoon, your evening. We certainly appreciate your time. We're excited for today's session. I'm personally very excited. And on that note, I'll introduce myself and then we'll go down our list here. So for those of you who have not met me before, my name is Jordan Ball. I'm the International New and Social Media Officer. I help run our live events, our digital experiences, our social media channels, as well as the Global Ambassador Program here on the Thunder Bay campus. Next, I'll pass over to Dr. Michael Moland, our special guest.
Okay, so first of all, I'd just like to welcome everyone to this webinar presentation. I'm pretty excited about doing it. This is something that I do every year for Lakehead University. Sometimes they do it on campus and sometimes they do it online as well. And what I've done today is I've selected some presentation material that generally has went over very well with students in the past. So when students actually find something interesting in class and then come up to me and say, you know, I found that really fascinating. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? I take note of that. And then over the course of the year, I pick snippets here and there to use in order to kind of facilitate these kinds of webinar presentations. So today I'm going to be talking about just some basic psychological principles, and I'm going to talk a little bit about illusions. And when I mention illusions, really what I'm referring to are things like visual illusions that I'm sure many of you have already had some personal experience with. We all find visual illusions quite fascinating. But in addition to that, there are other illusions. There's illusions maybe related to beliefs, for example, where we believe that something is related to something else, when in reality it's not. And that's actually known as an illusory correlation. So we're going to be talking about those kinds of illusions as well. I'll often say to my introductory psychology students that in many ways, psychology is like, we study things like magic tricks, and how you can be fooled by your everyday experiences, things that you experience in everyday life. So those are some of the things we're going to be talking about as well. Now, before
here, Michael,
sure.
Sorry, before we dive into the actual presentation and lecture, I'll just remind our viewers of a few special things, and then I'll pass it back to you if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
So in our Lakehead Explored series, we have our Lakehead Explored event, the International Student Sports and Advisors session on Thursday, May 26th at 9 a.m. That is our final Lakehead International Live of the season where I'll be hosting it. However, I have great news for those applicants that are joining us this fall 2022. We're going to be kicking off the transition series in the beginning of June, and that's going to run all the way from June until the middle to beginning of August. And so there's plenty more live events where you can participate and learn more about Lakehead, but also prepare for your own journey to Thunder Bay or Aurelia, Canada. With that being said, final reminders for our viewers. If you like what you see, don't worry, we are recording today's session. It will go up on our YouTube within a few business days. If you do have any questions, I'll remind you once again, we keep all of our questions within the Q&A. With that being said, if you are saying hello to a fellow guest you recognize, maybe you're saying hello, this is where I'm from, you have questions, if you're sharing emails, phone numbers, all that sort of stuff can happen in the chat. And last but not least, I'll encourage you to stay connected and follow us on our social media channels. And on that note, I'll pass it back to Mike and I'll give him the ropes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks for that. That was useful information, by the way, thanks. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is first of all say that if you do have any questions during the presentation, just please feel free to write them down and then save them toward the end. I believe we have about 10 or 15 minutes where you can actually ask me questions if you wish to do so right at the very end of the presentation. So I'll be kind of asking questions as we go along, things that I would normally do during any kind of presentation. So I want you to think a little bit more deeply about these kind of questions when we discuss them as we go through the presentation. Now, the very first thing I want to do is quite often, students actually, one of the most common things that students will say to me after the very first couple of classes, they'll say, psychology is not at all what I thought it was going to be. And that's really interesting for me to hear that. And I think part of it is because the media, the way the media portrays psychology is quite a bit different than what psychology really is as a science. So I think students are often really kind of shocked about that. And one of the first things I like to address in the class is that psychology is not just common sense. Why do I want to address that in the class? Because many students feel that psychology is just common sense because I have a lot of experience in the world now, or at least they feel that they have a lot of experience. And I've observed a lot of behaviors over my lifetime. And I think I have a good sense of why people do things, why people are motivated to do certain things, and why they're not motivated to do other things. And I will say, well, your observations, well, important to you, aren't necessarily scientific data, right? So we need to be aware of that. So one of the first things I do is I try to do a demonstration that psychology is not just common sense. And so I say, well, if you felt that psychology was just common sense, you would say that, well, then if you were given questions that dealt with psychological findings, you should get all of them right. So if psychology is just common sense, you should be able to get all these questions right if I give you a questionnaire. So what I do is I say, well, that kind of claim is very similar to a scientific theory, right? You create a theory and then you develop hypotheses to try to disconfirm that theory. So let's do a little bit of a test here. This is more of an informal test, but if psychology is all common sense, then you would expect if once I give you, and you can see on the screen right now, you can see these true and false questions. What I would like you to do is I'd like you to take just a few moments and answer them as best as you can. Don't spend too much time answering them, but just go through them, answer them as quickly as you can. If psychology is just common sense, you would expect then that most students should be able to get these questions correct. So let's take a few moments here, go through the questions. Once again, don't spend too much time on them. So for the very first one, psychologists study behavior in the mind, but not biology. Is that true or is that false? Question number 2, evidence suggests that sugar causes hyperactivity in children. Is that true or is that false? Question number 3, memory tends to be more accurate under hypnosis. Is that true or false? Question number 4, research evidence suggests that police departments have found psychics useful in helping to solve complex cases. Is that true or false? Question number 5, people learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. For example, auditory or visual learners. So some students will say, I'm more of a visual learner, I'm more of an auditory learner. Or some teachers will say that some students are more visual learners. They need to learn material in a visual modality in order to learn it best, for example. So is that true or false? Number 6, in love and relationships, overwhelmingly similarities rather than opposites attract one another to each other. Is that true or is that false? Number 7, research evidence suggests that a full moon does not have an effect on hospital admissions and criminal behavior. Is that true or is that false? Moving along to question number 8, research suggests that venting, in other words, releasing pent-up aggression, is not useful in helping a person deal with their anger. Is that true or is that false? Number 9, research evidence suggests that weather patterns have no effect on arthritic pain. Is that true or is that false? And then finally, question number 10, premenstrual syndrome or PMS does not often occur in women. Is that true or is that false?
Awesome. Well, we let some of our participants answer those polls. We have about 70% answered already, which is strong. I'll note that on your screen, you can see questions 1 and 7 are not in the poll. Those questions are both sort of introductions to what I will let Mike reveal at that point.
So, so Jordan, you said question number 1 and number 7 that I just read are not actually in the poll?
They're not, yes, but
Oh.
if you're familiar, I know you are, of course, familiar with the answers. I don't want to reveal where they start and where they stop in terms of true and
Okay.
false. So,
Well, let me see here. I'll take a look here. So if you're curious about the answers to these questions, let me take a look. Okay, just to make sure everything's okay. Okay, so if you're wondering about these, okay, great. We see some of the data here up on the screen. Okay, that's really interesting. So psychologists study behavior and the mind, but not biology. So the first 5 questions are false. The very first 5 questions are false. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are all false. And then from 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all true. So the question is, how did you do? So the first 5 are false and the last 5 are true. Now, characteristically, when I do this brief demonstration in class, students will often say they didn't do very well. So that seems to be at least the consensus. Very few students will say they get all these right. In fact, most of them will say that they didn't do very well. And part of the reason for that is these questions themselves are real findings in psychology, but they're also based on what are widely recognized as common myths of that students and the general population tend to have about psychology. So I could capitalize on that a little bit, knowing that in all likelihood, you'd probably get some of them wrong because people are often surprised. Now it's one thing to say you got these answers incorrect, but it's another to actually explain why. Now, I'll often say to the class that at the end of this course, if we went through this questionnaire again, you'd absolutely understand exactly why the first 5 questions were false and the last 5 questions were true. You'd understand that data. Now we can take a look here, just for example. So, and I like to explain things. To me, it's not enough just to say that something is correct and something is correct. I'd rather talk about, it's important to talk about the methodology behind and the reasoning why we know that to be correct through scientific research. So number 5, for example, people learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. These are individuals that are considered to be either auditory or visual learners. And remember, the answer to that is false. 92% here said it was actually true. Now, a lot of people still believe that, but if you look at the literature, you look at the research literature, you look at the scientific literature, you find that that is not the case. Now, the question here is, how would you test that, right? So we know in scientific investigations, it's important to conduct tests. So how would you test something like that? That is my question. And I usually pose that to the class. I ask, well, how would you set up a test to test something like that? And most students are unfamiliar because they're not familiar with how to test things in psychology. Now, what I could say is, well, what you can do, it's really simple, believe it or not. You could actually separate people into maybe auditory learners or visual learners based on some kind of measurement, some kind of test. And then you can actually expose them to material in the modality that they're, supposed to be, most likely to profit from you learning in that modality. So you can expose them to, you could teach them material and make sure to teach them in a visual kind of style, and then you can expose students to an auditory kind of style of teaching. And then the question is, when they're tested later on that material, how well do they do? You would expect that if students who are visual learners, if they're visual learners, then you would expect them to do better on when they learn in that style, and then when they're tested on a test of that material after they've learned in that style. And what we find is that's not the case. They don't do any better. So visual learners, for example, they don't do any better on tests of the material, of the content, when they're taught in that kind of manner. They don't do any better. So what the research literature is finding is that generally students do well when they're exposed to a teaching environment that involves a wide variety of different types of learning. So things like demonstrations, things like presentations, things like video clips, opportunities to discuss the material in depth and to have you think deeply about the material. And this is referred to as critical thinking. So I just thought I'd use that as an example. Okay, let's move along to the next slide. Okay, let's take a look here. So psychology defined, one of the very first things that students are surprised about when I talk about psychology and introductory psychology is that psychology is a science. A lot of students are surprised by that. They're kind of shocked. They go, really, it's a science? Well, I've never seen it presented in that kind of way on TV. Now, once again, remember I said earlier that students are often surprised because they'll say that psychology isn't quite what they expect it to be once they start learning about scientific psychology. So psychology is a science. So what is a science? So is it a field of study? Occasionally I'll have someone say, well, is it not? So, in public school and high school, you take biology, you might take science, you might take English. And so it sounds almost like it's some kind of, course of study, something that you take. A friend of mine, his daughter recently said, oh, I said, what are you taking in school right now? Well, I'm taking science, I'm taking math, I'm taking, gym, I'm taking, biology, I'm learning about, plants and things like that. And I said, well, okay, well, in science, so what are you learning about in science? Well, that's where I'm learning about plants. So are you learning about the scientific method? No, they're not learning about the scientific method. Usually when they're learning about science, they're learning about things like labeling things, and they're learning about things maybe related to the natural world. Well, really, the idea of when you think of science, think of it more as a verb. Really, it's a way of doing things. It's a way of investigating questions that we have about the natural world. So it's more of a method. It's more of a verb. It's an action more than just a discipline. So it's a method. It's an approach to evidence. And I love this statement. It involves a brutal competition of evidence, a systematic set of strategies for answering questions. And it involves observation and testing. So students are often surprised by that. About 75% of all the studies, research studies discussed in an introductory psychology course involve experiments. So students are surprised. They would expect maybe more things like surveys and basic observations, but no, about 75% involve actual experiments, scientific experiments. As you can see here in the next line, it says that surveys show a large percentage of the public doubts that psychology is truly scientific. Now, if you've been paying attention so far to this presentation, you probably think I know why now. It may be related to what Mike alluded to before, and that was that the media generally doesn't portray psychology or psychologists as very scientific. So people are left with an impression that psychology is not very scientific, and it's just very much like common sense. Now, I gave you a demonstration already where I said, I don't think psychology is common sense. I want to give you a demonstration that that enhances that that claim. So, and you found that for most part, it was pretty challenging to answer those kinds of questions. So is psychology just common sense? Well, no, it isn't. And the issue here is that quite often people feel psychology involves topics that are so intimately familiar to them that they think it's just common sense. Because every day, it's almost like we're naive psychologists. Every day we interact with others, and we go to work or we go to school, we go to the classroom, and we observe other people, and we think we can often make certain connections between why people are engaged in certain kinds of behaviors. Now, the reality is sometimes we're right. Sometimes we make correct assumptions, but at other times we are incorrect, we're wrong. And quite often people aren't aware, they don't get that feedback. They're unaware when they actually can make mistakes. And part of the reason for discussing psychology and learning about it is to learn about the mistakes that we kind of make, the illusions that we might have about certain relationships that we think we see in behaviors. So for the example here, it's if you read about physics, for example, you read about a finding in physics, often it's hard to relate to that material, right? You'll say, well, can't really relate to it, but I trust the research finding. Now, the difference is in psychology, when you read about a finding that's related to aggression or it's related to things like helping behavior and altruism, we have a lot of experience in that area. We have a lot of experience observing patterns of behavior in real life. So we think we understand those kind of behaviors very well, right? Something that we can easily relate to. Now, the problem here, and it's referred to actually, you can see here on the slide, is the hindsight bias. So if we think that psychology is just common sense, then we probably will feel that we don't have to study for the course. We don't have to study the material because it's just common sense, right? Well, this is a trap that students can run into as well, because then they don't even bother getting the textbook and they say, oh, it's just common sense. But keep in mind that, hindsight is 2020. Quite often things seem like common sense after we know the answer. And I think about years ago when I was in high school taking physics, probably studying projectile motion problems with calculus or using vectors. And I remember if we find an answer, and then we look to the back of the textbook to see if we were correct. And if we were not correct, my friend and I, we were studying together, we'd now try to work backward through the problem to see until we got the correct answer. And then once we did, we said, geez, that was easy. Well, no, it's not easy, right? It was only easy once we knew the answer. So then the big mistake we made was we went to the very first test and we didn't do very well on it. We thought, well, what happened there? Well, because we were actually struggling and we convinced ourselves that we weren't, because we had the answers. We just thought, oh, this is pretty easy. Once we came up with the answer, we just overestimated the tendency to think that it was really easy. But these kind of things occur after the fact. So we have to be careful about that. And when we're studying psychological findings. The next point is naive realism. It's the belief that we see the world as it really is. And this relates to what we're talking about again, about things like illusions and illusions related to things like beliefs, about how the natural world works, and things like illusions related to visual illusions. And you can see an example of that on the slide here. When we think there's a relationship between two things and there is not, for example, one of the questions that was asked previously related to sugar and hyperactivity. I think the question went something like, evidence suggests that sugar causes hyperactivity in children. Actually, the answer to that is false. And there's been at least 50 research studies that have examined that relationship. So experiments that are conducted. And what they find is there's no relationship between the two. What they find there, in addition to that, is when people have expectations. So when people think that their child has consumed sugar, they're more likely then to believe that the child is hyperactive. If the child has consumed sugar, but the parent is under the impression that they haven't, they won't regard their child as any more hyperactive. So the perception in that situation seems to be a very important component in explaining that kind of myth about sugar and hyperactivity. So if you take a look here, you can see the tops of these tables, and this is known as Shepard's tables. Roger Shepard is a psychologist, and he uncovered this illusion, I believe, in around 1990. Now, if you take a look at the top of the tables, believe it or not, they're exactly identical. So if you cut out one of the top of the table on the left, you could actually put it perfectly, it would fit perfectly on the top of the table on the right. Most people say that's not right, that's impossible. Well, once again, this is an illusion, right? This is an illusion. Now, often people have questions, well, why is that? Well, for this illusion, it seems to be related to our perception of three-dimensional images. It's related to that. I also see that they're related to some other illusions. For instance, on the table on the left, the very top part of it, you may notice that the very top part of the table seems a little bit wider than the very bottom part of that flat part of the table. It seems like it narrows a little bit toward the bottom. And that's related, actually, that might be related to what is known as the Ponzo illusion, something we're going to be talking about a little bit later. One of the considered to be the grandfather of all biases is the confirmation bias. And it pleases me to no end that years ago when I talk about the confirmation bias, I've been teaching introductory psychology here at Lakehead University for 29 years. So when I used to talk about confirmation bias, students would say, well, that's really fascinating. That's really interesting. But now students are actually familiar with the concept because a lot of these concepts I'm talking about today now are becoming more widely understood. They're becoming more widely disseminated. So more people know about these kinds of concepts. So the confirmation bias is the tendency to look for evidence that confirms your belief. And part of the reason why it's considered to be the grandfather of all scientific biases is because it's important, if you want to think more scientifically, to be able to rein in that kind of bias. Now, if you take a look here, the last thing I want to talk about in this slide is you can see some animals, images of animals on the slide. You can see a dog and you can see a cat here. Now, the question I have is, how about if you were studying young infants and you're curious, so young infants, maybe 4 months old, what kind of things do they look at when they look at an image? What kind of things do they find interesting? Now, granted, the 4-month-old can't tell you. They're unable to verbally explain to you what they're looking at, right? So many people would say, well, you can't test that. That falls, that falls out of the realm of science because it's untestable. They would say that it's not falsifiable. Well, in this case, believe it or not, a lot of things that people think is untestable is actually testable in psychology. So for instance, what we find is young infants, what they'll do is if they find something interesting, they'll stare at it. It's referred to as gaze duration. So they'll stare at it over a period of time, but then just like anyone, they'll get bored of it, right? So they'll get bored of it. Now, if you show them the same kind of stimuli, the same kind of image repeatedly, they'll just be bored because they have already seen that image. So they get bored really, really quickly. But then if you show them something a little bit different, quite often it re-engages their attention. They're suddenly now kind of attuned to what you're showing them and they're interested in it. So what you can do here to capitalize on that, imagine this. So you're curious to know what infants look at. Do they look at the face or they look at the body? So imagine showing them repeated images of the cat. You can see here on the upper right-hand part of the slide. So you show them repeated images of the cat, right? And then how do you determine whether the infant is actually looking at the face or not? Well, if you look below the cat here, you see a dog. Well, it's actually a dog's head on a cat's body. That would be if the infant is looking at the face of the cat, and all of a sudden that changes so that now it's a dog's head on a cat's body. Notice that the cat's body is the same. The only thing that's changed there is now there's a dog's head. That infant, if they look at a series of cats, they'll get bored. But suddenly, if they're looking at the face, they should show renewed interest or dishabituation to that image because now suddenly they're looking at a dog's head. There's suddenly a change there. But that wouldn't happen if they're looking at the body because the body hasn't changed, right? So that gives researchers an idea of what it is that infants seem to look at. And that's just one method. There's many different methods. Researchers can use things like cortical evoked potentials and things like that. They can use EEG and measure brainwave activity on a person's scalp. It's completely non-invasive. It doesn't hurt the infant or it doesn't hurt the individual at all. And they can monitor things like attentional processes to see to what extent the infant recognizes that there's a change there. So there's other methods as well, but that's just one of them. Okay, let's move on to the very next slide. This is the very last slide. This is a very short presentation. And what I'm hoping it'll do is really just whet your appetite and get you excited about the field of psychology and the cool things that you actually learn about at the university level. So the very first thing I want to talk about, you can see here, and this is Adelson's squares. So this is an illusion as well. You may have seen this illusion before. It may have been emailed to you. You may have seen it online. So this is an illusion. You can see here, if you check it out, you see a cylinder, a green cylinder, and it's placed upon something that looks kind of like a checkerboard, right? So you see this cylinder, green cylinder, and it's casting a shadow toward the left part of the checkerboard. And you see two squares here. You see a square denoted by A, and you see a square denoted by B. Now, most people will say that the B square looks brighter in terms of hue, right? In terms of shading, in terms of color compared to the A square. So the B looks a little bit brighter than the A. Now, the reality there is that the shade of the A square is exactly the same as the shade of the B square. This always, this is always so exciting to show this in class because students invariably just say, no way, that can't be. And to be honest, when I look at it right now, I don't see much of that illusion anymore because I've looked at it so frequently, but there's not really much different. I don't see any difference. They both look like the same shade to me. Now, the question is, why are we fooled by that? And researchers, what they do is they try out things. They think, well, if, just like any good scientist, they think, okay, they'll develop a theory of why that occurs, and then they'll start testing it, right? So they'll say, well, maybe it's because the cylinder is casting a shadow, which is creating a darkened area, a darkened pattern in that area denoted by square B. And so maybe what is going on there is our brain says, okay, I recognize that square A and square B are the same shade, but square B is darker than it should be because it's in a shadow. So what seems to be going on there is our brain seems to be compensating and say, okay, I'll help you out here in terms of perception. B is the same shade as A, but it's in shadow. It's darker than it should be. So I'll make it a little bit brighter for you so you'll perceive it more accurately. Well, in reality, we see that as an illusion because that's not what's going on. But it suggests what's happening here is our brain's trying to help us out. Our brain's trying to help us out based on expectations, based on prior learning, based on experience in the world. And it's trying to help us out in being able to perceive those kind of things more accurately. And this is actually known as color constancy, and we see this in a lot of different areas. Now, similarly, you can see here I had mentioned this a little bit earlier about the Ponzo illusion when we're talking about Shepard's tables. You can see an example of the Ponzo illusion here where you see the railroad track and then you see the two horizontal lines, the red lines, one above each other on the track. You may have noticed that the above line appears that it's longer than the lower red line on the track. Why is that? Well, that's known as the Ponzo illusion. The reason why that seems to occur is because of a linear perspective. It's a monocular depth cue that we can recognize with only one eye. What it suggests is that anything up higher in the frame is more distant because you can see the tracks are converging toward the distance. And we know that if we're standing on a railroad track, which we shouldn't do if we want to be careful, if we're standing on a railroad track, we look in the distance, we can tell that the track is, the lines are parallel to each other, but in the distance they appear to converge. And it tells us that it gives us distance cues. So if we take a look at those two lines, we know that it seems at least that the upper red bar is further away. Now, it's because they're the same size, it's like our brain says, okay, those two lines are essentially the same size, but one is further away. If something seems to be the same size as something else, but we know it to be further away, we know that it must be a bigger object. So the brain automatically compensates for that. And that seems to be the explanation for that kind of illusion. You can see another example of the Ponzo illusion here with these older model Ford Escapes. You can see here on the left-hand side, these small SUVs. You can see the linear perspective is being capitalized on here because you see a street and in the one vehicle that's in the very low right-hand part of the slide, you see that it looks closer to us compared to the one in the upper right-hand part of the slide. So linear perspective, once again, just like the railroad tracks, is being capitalized on here. And the one in the very low right-hand part of the slide, it looks small compared to the one in the upper left-hand part of the slide. The reality is they're all the same size. You can measure them. They're all the same size, but this capitalizes on that same effect. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here in this short presentation is the McGurk effect. This one usually really blows students away. So I don't want to give you too much information about it, but it involves auditory processing as well as visual processing at the same time, and how we often use visual cues to help us listen, to help us understand what a person is saying. So Jordan, if you could cue up the McGurk Effect video, let's watch this and we'll talk a little bit about it.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this.
Ba,
What do you hear?
ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing bar with a B.
Ba, ba. Ba,
It's an illusion known as the McGurk Effect.
ba,
Take another look.
ba,
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
ba,
Now to the left of the screen.
ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is bar with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
Ba. The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the McGurk effect for 25 years now, and I've been the face in the stimuli. I've seen stimuli thousands and thousands of times, but the effect still works on me. I can't help it. The speech brain just takes in that information and doesn't care about what outside knowledge you bring to bear. Ba, 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 ba.
The McGurk effect shows us that what we hear may not always be the truth.
Ba,
But it also helps us to understand what happens when our senses conflict.
ba, ba, ba. When the brain has the conflicting information, it tries to make sense of that conflict. And depending on what type of modality is providing more, I guess, salient information, that information might override or at least combine with the other information.
So we can't always trust what we hear, because sometimes our sense of vision takes over, enabling us to maintain a coherent view of the world.
Okay, so that's pretty fascinating there. I hope that you were completely blown away from it like I was the first time I saw the McGurk Effect video. So once again, in this kind of situation, there's a conflict between what you're hearing and then what you're seeing. So it suggests that visual components of speech. So when we watch someone speak, we actually do pay attention to how their lips and their faces are moving, and then we use those cues to guide what it is they're actually saying. Quite often in research, this is referred to as, the visual component of this is referred to as visual capture. It seems like when we're exposed to auditory information and visual information, the visual information often kind of reigns supreme, or it has a major influence. What we see has a major influence, and that can, you see in this case, influence the way we actually hear what the person is saying. So that's pretty remarkable. So let me stop the presentation here. It looks like we're a little bit over time anyway. So let me stop the presentation here, and then I'll hand it over to Jordan if you'd like to say a few words, and we can maybe open things to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. So to our audience members, I want to remind you now is your opportunity to certainly submit questions related to the presentation, to psychology studies in general. Of course, if you have general questions about Lakehead University, you're more than welcome to submit those using the Q&A as well, and Hector will be behind the scenes to answer those. I do want to make a quick comment about the presentation. I mean, I certainly found it quite thrilling. To be honest, I'm a bit worried about maybe the recording afterwards and realizing that my camera was on during some of those illusions. I felt the need to like cover an eye every once in a while and actually verify were the checkered squares the same gray. I mean, you noted that maybe you've seen this so many times that they were appearing the same color, but for a first time perspective, I absolutely still can't really see the same color whatsoever. So it's definitely interesting. And then of course, even on my end, the table, for example, or the chairs and the illusion of one being larger than the other, just utilizing the natural vantage point of that linear perspective, that really threw me too. I was convinced that those SUVs were drastically different sizes on the screen. And I'm curious, I had a little sticky note here on my end, and I was measuring it with the sticky note, trying to wrap my head around it. So
I do the exact
sure
same
the
thing.
audience had a similar idea. So we do have a first question. This is going back to the questionnaire. It says, what does ESP stand for? I believe there's a question related to that.
Oh, I had changed that in one of the edits actually for the slides. And so we re-edited it again and we lost that edit, but it just stands for extrasensory perception. It's just kind of like psychic ability. That's actually a very common question when I do this presentation in class. People put up their hand and ask that, what is ESP? When I was younger, I'm not going to say how much younger, maybe in the 70s, maybe not. It was much more common to talk about ESP. So it was much more kind of in the general lingo of the population at that time. But yeah, it's kind of like psychic ability.
Awesome. We have another question. It said, could we use this illusion to treat patients or generally in practice?
For which illusion? Which illusion is being discussed?
A good point. Yeah. So to our audience member that submitted that question, if you want to clarify which illusion you're curious about, I know I'm going to pass back to Mike to list off some of the illusions we just discussed.
See, it depends on the illusion, but if you want to be creative here, just say, for example, if you're working in a clinical environment, right, with patients, with clients, and the client is depressed, for example, quite often people who are severely depressed also have illusions. They'll say things like, nothing ever goes right for me. If I'm driving in the city, I always seem to get the red lights, right? They'll say these kinds of things. These are known as cognitive distortions in individuals that are depressed. These are thought patterns that are negative thought patterns that really do not help the depression at all. In fact, it can make the depression worse. So one of the treatments, there's a host of different treatments for depression, but one of the cognitive behavioral treatments involves changing those kind of maladaptive thought patterns. Now, the issue here is you could maybe use these illusions and say, well, you may not recognize right now that the things you're saying are probably not going to be true. It may feel like you always get the red lights, but that's probably not exactly true. That may be an illusion there. And you could actually maybe use some real visual illusions to show them, see, if you can be fooled by this kind of illusion, maybe you can also be fooled by the same illusions you may have about the things you see, the patterns you see around you. This can be used maybe as a strategy to help a client think a little bit more deeply about these kinds of these distortions, these negative beliefs they have about the way that they interact with the environment. So in that way, illusions you could use them as a way of helping clients better understand how they can be fooled by things. So if they think that all these negative things always happen to them, it could be true in some instances, but you could use maybe an illusion to help them understand that they could potentially be misguided here. They could be wrong in their assumption. So that could be a useful way of using illusions there.
Awesome. We have another question. It says, it seems what we learn from those examples is that we can't trust our own perceptions. How do you reconcile that with the study of psychology?
Yeah, so the best way of responding that is actually keep in mind that quite often we are correct. So really, our perceptions have done a really good job in helping us live our lives so far, right? And get along well in everyday life. One thing I want to mention, these questions are great, by the way. Thanks so much for these great questions. So, our perceptions are quite often correct. Quite often, so if someone asks me, Mike, can you go into the store and get me some milk, for example? And it's, for instance, a store I've never been in before, right? Do I just go up every single aisle and, just look for milk? No, I'll already have some preconceived notions about where milk will likely be, right? I believe that milk will probably be in the back part of the store, or maybe on the side in some kind of cooled, refrigerated area, right? So quite often, it doesn't matter what our our perceptions are, quite often they're correct. But the whole real emphasis of science here and the relevance to psychology is we have to be careful. We have to be exceedingly careful. We have to constantly say to ourselves, how might I be wrong here? So what the scientific method does and scientific thinking, it leads us to be very careful about the assumptions that we make. So we need to be cautious. We might say, okay, I could be correct here, right? And it seems that, you know, the perceptions that I have seem to be working out okay for me, but there could be times where I am wrong, and I need to be aware of those, more aware that I could be wrong at those times and be a little bit more careful about the assumptions I make. That's an excellent question.
Awesome. We have another one in the chat this time. It says, does coffee help relieve psychological strike? And with that, I'm also going to pose the question to the chat. Does coffee give you personally more energy? So to everyone in the audience, I would love to hear whether or not coffee, a cup of coffee, whether it's in the morning, gives you that burst of energy that you need to get started, or even at night, if you know, maybe you've had a dinner, you enjoy a coffee after to sit around and stay up after that. But back to you, Mike. In your opinion or in your own studies, does the coffee help?
So I'm familiar with coffee, and I'm familiar with caffeine, the active ingredient in coffee, because caffeine actually is a stimulant. So caffeine actually can perk you up, right? And I actually don't drink coffee, believe it or not. I'm not even sure why I don't drink coffee, but I don't drink coffee, but most of my friends do. But the evidence suggests that absolutely caffeine in coffee is a stimulant. So it tends to activate the sympathetic nervous system. It makes us more aroused. It tends to enhance neurotransmitters, the brain's chemical messengers, including norepinephrine, for example. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical messenger that seems to be important for producing arousal in the central nervous system. So it tends to enhance the effects of norepinephrine in the brain. So definitely it is a stimulant. The interesting thing about caffeine too is that people will often respond in interesting ways, and this relates to the psychological component again. If people are conditioned to drink coffee in the morning, quite often, you know, they don't even have to drink the full cup. This is kind of funny, but you know, because stimulants will often, whether it's nicotine from cigarettes or caffeine from coffee, they'll stimulate bowel movements. So people will need to go to the bathroom after they drink coffee or have maybe the first cigarette in the morning. But the interesting thing there is there's a pattern, because sometimes people just have to take a first little sip and suddenly they need to go to the bathroom already, right? So this suggests that there's probably not enough caffeine. They probably haven't sort of absorbed it clearly quick enough for that kind of effect to occur. So other factors seem to be in play there. And a lot of those factors seem to be related to classically conditioned cues related to learning. And this is something you'd learn about, things like Pavlov's paradigms in introductory psychology. Yeah, good question.
Awesome. We have a few more in the Q&A and then we'll have to wrap it up. But
okay, sure.
I really like what's coming in so far. So it says, hi, thanks for the excellent presentation. Is there a link between recognizing these illusions and cognitive psychology?
Actually, well, a lot of it is related. In fact, if I teach a class in cognitive psychology as well. So if you go through a cognitive psychology textbook, you're going to usually encounter a perception chapter that talks a lot about things like illusions. And absolutely, there's a real direct connection. Why? Well, because it's important for us, when you look at illusion, a lot of people are fooled by that illusion, right? So really, scientists are really curious about the mistakes we make. So if I make a mistake in illusion, and then everyone else seems to be making that same mistake, it suggests something about how the brain might be wired in that case, right? It gives us perhaps a little bit more information about how the brain is organized. So the question is, why do we make that mistake? You know, that's very fascinating. Why are we making that mistake? And if we can understand why we're making that mistake, it might help us better understand how the brain is organized and what areas of the brain seem to be involved in making that error and that illusion. So that's one reason why psychologists are intimately fascinated with illusions as well, because they help us in indirect ways learn a little bit more about how the brain is organized. That's an excellent question as well. And I love showing illusions in class, and because they're just always so captivating.
Awesome. So we have another one from here. It says, what is your biggest challenge in developing critical thinking skills?
Okay, these questions are fantastic. What's the biggest challenge, right? I think the biggest challenge, and I think about critical thinking every day, honestly, no word of a lie. I think the biggest challenge is to get students to practice critical thinking skills, because it's one thing to, learn a little bit more about critical thinking, learn about things like confirmation bias, learn about things like the hindsight bias, for example, and even things like illusory correlation or availability heuristic or representativeness heuristics. All of these concepts are related to critical thinking, really and remember, critical thinking doesn't mean like you're just being critical. It means that you're being careful, right? You want to say, well, how do they know? So you read some evidence or you read some information, you read a claim. The question is, how do we know that whether that's true or not? Who said it? Where does it come from? Does it come from a published journal? Is that journal peer reviewed, right? We have to ask those kind of questions. But what happens is we may learn a little bit about critical thinking in the classroom. You think, oh, that's really fascinating. But then you have to practice it. You have to practice it. You have to really digest it, because otherwise, as soon as you're done in the classroom, you get out in the real world and you're bombarded by illusions and claims and things like that. And it's so easy just to fall into that kind of trap and start, sort of being easily influenced by all the things you see, for example. So I think that's the challenge. The good thing about the textbook I use currently, it talks about critical thinking at the very beginning and the importance of critical thinking, which is incredibly important. But what it does is it reiterates those themes as you go throughout the textbook. Some textbooks will talk about it at the beginning, and then as you go through, you might have some questions and say, hey, well, really, can't we think a little bit more critically about that concept that's being presented? Well, our textbook, the one I'm using right now, the Lilienfeld textbook, it actually reminds you constantly as you go through. Remember what we talked about where correlation doesn't mean causation here, right? So it reminds you of those things. And that's one of the reasons why I love our textbook, is because it just constantly reminds you. So it gets you to practice and to keep thinking about concepts related to critical thinking as you move through the material that you're learning. Absolutely fantastic. Great question. I love that question.
Awesome. So I have a couple more that I also think you're going to appreciate. So this one says, if brains have tendencies to adjust all over senses up to understandable levels, can't we use this kind of technique or psychology towards a new perspective of world?
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. The brain has ability to adjust, right? We know that the brain has ability to adjust, and it does. Really, when we were talking about the McGurk effect, really what part of what we're talking about there is known as top-down processing. Top-down processing is a term you learn when you learn about sensation and perception. It relates to how our experiences in the world, our learning and expectations influence our perception. Really, it's as simple as that, right? But so how do we develop these kind of experiences? Well, we develop them through life experience, right? So as we get older, as we age, as we grow and develop, we develop different expectations about the world. We develop different understandings based on this kind of learning. And so this can influence the way we actually understand the world as well. Now, granted, sometimes we can develop expectations that are not true or beliefs that are not true about the way the world actually works, right? And that might hinder us. And this is another reason why it's important to learn about these concepts that we're talking about in psychology. In fact, I wish everyone learned about them earlier, because as much as it's fun in introductory psychology to introduce students to these concepts for the very first time, often I'm shocked that a lot of these concepts we've known about for the last 50 years. But students will go, oh my God, that's amazing. That's remarkable. I'm so blown away by that. But I'll say, but that's like you saying to me that you're just so remarkably fascinated with the concept of gravity, right? We've known about gravity for a very, very long period of time, right? So the question is, why don't we learn about these kind of things at a younger age in a lot of these courses? But still, it's really enjoyable and it's fun to teach.
Awesome. And the final question we have for today, and potentially most thought-provoking, especially as this session is geared towards new applicants that are at a younger generation. It says, what's the biggest trend you've noticed among psychology students over the years? Have you noticed any changes since the digital era, i.e. wide use of the internet or access to the internet?
Gee, that's a really good question. See, the challenge there would be if, in order to provide, my opinion on that, it would be based mostly on anecdotes, right? And we have to be very careful about anecdotes because anecdotes, the plural of anecdote isn't data, right? So I'm really not that familiar with the research and the scientific findings in that kind of way. On the one hand, I could say that what's remarkable nowadays is that we have such easy access to information. I joke with some of my introductory students, they'll maybe complain about having to go into the online library and look up a research article. And I'll say, what we had to do when I was your age, I had to actually go in a physical library and I had to get out books and then I had to find indexes and look for concepts, look for information. And then I had to find them in these large volumes of these journals. And it was very time consuming. It was a lot of work, right? It was a lot of labor. So it's nice to have so much access to information. Now we have to be careful, of course, because some of that information might not be good information, right? So one thing we do talk about in introductory psychology is, what's the difference between good evidence and not so good evidence? So I think access to information is just fantastic. I'll have students come up to me and talk about a concept in psychology and I'll ask them, how do you know about that? It's not even talked about in a textbook. And it's because they've been just learning. They maybe saw a YouTube video or something like that. I think that's fantastic just to have that access and for it to inspire students, right? To learn about something new and for it to inspire them. So I think that part is absolutely fantastic.
Awesome. Well, I think that is a great conclusion to another amazing session. I want to thank you first and foremost for joining us and hosting that sample lecture. Before I let you go, I'm going to do a quick outro with the audience, and then we'll do our final goodbyes in just a moment. So to our viewers, I want to remind you to follow us on our social media channels. You can find us at Lakehead International on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. If you want to explore our campuses, check out our residence, our laboratories, our cafeterias, all that sort of stuff, you can head over to lakeheadu.ca/tours and do that from the comfort of your own home. If you want to attend some of our other upcoming events, we have one this Thursday. And then we'll have events running from June all the way through until August that will help you as a new applicant potentially transition to Lakehead University. On that note, if you are a new applicant to Lakehead University and you are joining us for the fall 2022 intake, I want to remind you about our Your Choice Matters campaign. I'm going to take this opportunity to remind those applicants, if you have an offer to Lakehead University, you've received a letter of acceptance, this is your opportunity to participate, share your pride about joining Lakehead, and also have a chance to win one of 10 amazing prizes. So you can see here on this website, it's simply yourchoicematters.ca. You can actually participate by submitting your photo, a really great place from where you love in your hometown or in your home country, and then you get to join the incoming class of 2022. By joining, of course, you'll be able to win one of 10 great prizes. We've already announced prizes 1, 2, 3, and we will be announcing prize 4 later today. And you will still be in the running though for prizes 5 through the top prize, which is going to be announced next Wednesday at the Your Choice Matters live draw. And that is first year residence and a meal plan, so a value of $14,000 Canadian. So I'll flip it back to the PowerPoint. I will give Mike an opportunity to say his final goodbyes, and then we will be wrapping it up, folks.
Yeah, I always have a hard time saying goodbye to the class. It's always an emotional time at the very end of the year when you have to say goodbye to the class. I think partly when you have a great class, everyone interacts and it feels like an experience. Students will say, I actually look forward to coming to class. So, it's like a family, right? So I joke, but it's kind of true. I often have a hard time saying goodbye to everyone at the very end of the year. But what I'd like to say is thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak during this webinar, for this webinar. I'm just so thoroughly impressed by the caliber of the questions that I was asked. And it's just so much fun. I tell people I think I have the best job in the world because I talk about concepts that I find remarkably fascinating. I get to share that information. I get to share research findings with a wide variety of students, and nothing is more satisfying and fulfilling than that. So thank you so much for all the really good questions. It was so much fun doing this presentation today. I hope that was seen in the amount of excitement that I was showing during the presentation. So thanks everyone for attending.
Awesome. Well, on behalf of the Lakehead International team, but also for our audience, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure working with you. To our audience, thank you again for joining us. We always appreciate the engagement, the questions you bring, and of course, the excitement that you foster as you prepare for your own journey here to Canada. On that note, folks, I'll wrap up today's session, and hopefully we will see you at the next one. Bye for now.
Take care.
Thank you for checking out today's video. If you have any questions, you can always comment below. Stay connected and follow us on our social media channels to stay informed about upcoming webinars and get an insider sneak peek of Lakehead University. See you next time.